Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. So glad that you're here. This is episode 87 of the Grow Podcast. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello, David.
Welcome to episode 87.
87.
1987, the year I was born. So I always like 87. The 87 Twins, first Minnesota team in a major sport to win a championship.
It's the year I graduated from high school.
Well, you brought it up, not me. So tell me one thing you remember from 1987. Pastor Mike.
I graduated from high school.
Okay.
I started
It's going to be a great podcast today, everybody. Oh, man. Yeah. Episode 87. Nothing. That's all you got.
That's all I've got. Sorry.
Well, the Twins won the World Series. They beat the St. Louis Cardinals in 7 games. The first ever World Series where the home team won every single game. That had never happened before.
I remember watching it in my college lounge where a bunch of us gathered.
That's cool.
It. Yeah, that
we were in Australia at the time. I was born, I think, right after they won.
So you remember watching it?
Yeah, I have a few memories of watching. Yeah. No, my dad has a distinct memory of 87 because he's a huge Twins fan. Mm-hmm. Grew up they were his favorite. I mean, he loved sports, loved the Vikings. But the Twins were, his number one thing, which as they are for me. And of course he's in Australia when this is happening. And they did air the World Series there, but and they aired it live, but it was at
probably be in the middle of the night
2 o'clock in the morning. And, so my sister would have been not quite 2 years old yet. And my mom is 9 months pregnant with me, ready to give birth, and he's awake watching it, silently screaming because he doesn't want to wake up the 1-year-old and his pregnant wife. And I'm not 100% sure. I might be remembering this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it just aired. It's just there was no, you didn't hear, Jack Buck or whoever was calling the game. Yeah. It was just, here's the video of the game, maybe the stadium audio or whatever. So there's no, and I don't probably know commercials too. I know when the NFL would air over there, at least maybe it's changed now, but it would just be, here it is. And so that's how this huge Twins fan got to finally experience a Twins World Series.
My dad, is a huge Twins fan and went
what a
to
great
those.
Guy.
And so this was when I was in college, obviously in the days before cell phones. So the only thing we had on our dorm room was a payphone in the middle.
Oh, man. So you didn't even have the phones in your room?
No, not then. I did later by my senior year.
Our producer just mouthed to me that you're old.
Yeah. So. But they, all of our parents had the payphone's phone number.
Sure.
So they got. So as soon as they won, the phone started ringing, and I knew it was my dad.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was fun.
So just anybody answers the payphone, and then
answer and then.
Hey, I'm looking for Mike.
You just yell down the floor. That's what it was.
You had it on your floor.
Yeah, it was on the floor.
Okay. So there was one on every floor.
Yeah, one on every floor.
Okay.
Right
So
in
I
the middle of the floor.
So it wasn't the hardest thing to get a hold of someone.
No.
I remember I went to Crown College in Minnesota, where my parents went when it was St. Paul Bible College, and there's this big. Have you ever been there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
my parents went there.
I don't know if I knew that.
Yeah.
Did they would have gone when it was actually in St. Paul, maybe?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Yeah. But I've been to the new.
Yeah. So there's
new location.
There's this big, quote unquote new, big long entryway. Yeah. The building's in the shape of a cross, and so you walk into the top of the cross, and there's this big long entryway, and but kind of when you get to the guts of the building, I guess you could say. Out of this big entryway, there was still this tiny little room, the size of a broom closet, and there was a payphone in there. And I was just why do we still have this payphone at our college in 2006? I mean, not once did I ever see a human in there using it. But so when you were saying there's this payphone, I pictured there was one payphone at the school at the front. That
every floor had one.
Hopefully someone's walking by and can walk up and find you.
Yeah.
I like that. Payphone on every floor. We had an actual phone in our room, so people could call. If my parents wanted to call, I got my first cell phone while I attended there, but not when I started. So they could call the front desk, and then get whatever patched over
by
in my room or whatever.
By my senior year, we could have one installed in our room, but it was on us, and so I did.
You did?
Yeah.
Which was probably a pretty big deal.
It kind of was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Calling all the...
No one knew the term internet at that time.
Well, I mean, someone knew it.
Yeah, someone knew it. Because it had been around for a while.
No one at Oakwood knew it.
I was like the first person... Okay, I'm really digging myself, and we aren't talking about anything with that.
I was
one of the first people in my dorm with a computer in my room.
You had a computer in your room?
I did.
In what year?
Apple IIgs.
What year was this?
1987.
You had a computer in your room in 1987?
Yeah,
That's
Apple
a huge deal.
It was a huge deal. Yeah.
How did that
happen? And a dot matrix printer.
Was that with the little holes in the sides?
Yeah. You get it.
Fantastic.
You just go through. Yeah.
Oh my word. Well, let's talk about something even older than you.
Yes.
The Book of Esther.
Yeah.
Right? It is older than you?
Close.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to double check. You do have some dates in here today.
I do.
Lots of history today. Which I know you're excited about it. Now that anytime I'm in a good mood when the podcast starts, now the people that hate history just turn it off and wait for next week. But
that's why we spent some time in my history, because we're going back into history.
But yeah, so again, as we always say, if you missed the weekend teaching, pause.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you are already on YouTube. Most of you actually are already on YouTube. So just go watch the weekend teaching and then come back, because this always supplements the weekend. Almost always, 99% of the time. So make sure you're always joining us on the weekend at one of our locations, either in person or online. But you preached on Esther, a great book, an interesting book.
It is an interesting book.
I have a question about Esther. I'm going to sprinkle it in when I feel when I feel is opportune.
Try and catch me off guard.
Yeah, that's my goal. Okay. That's my only goal for the podcast, is see if I've pretty much failed at that, but I'm going to keep trying. But it's also kind of in a weird place, and especially its location in the Bible. One of the interesting things of going through how we've been doing it through the story is, Esther's kind of like. It should be.
It feels like it's earlier in the story,
right? And honestly, in my brain, it is, because in my brain, it's just First Kings is happening, like Esther's going on somehow at the same time, though obviously
some of the last events, recorded events before what we call the silent years, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks, and then the coming of Jesus. Yeah. So the exile.
So is it taking place? Talk to us about that.
Okay,
when is Esther taking place, and how is it connected with all the rest of the Old Testament?
Yeah, let's do a quick rewind, because we're in the time called the exile, actually after the exile. So the times of the kingdom of the prophets, there was the United Kingdom, and then the divided kingdom, civil war. Then eventually Israel fell to Assyria. And then in 586 BC, Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, Judah, fell to Nebuchadnezzar. In 586 BC, Jerusalem was completely wiped out, and very few people were left there. There was a few, but not many people left there. But about 19 years before that, Nebuchadnezzar was actually there to put down a rebellion.
Yep.
And Nebuchadnezzar wasn't king yet. His dad was king, and there was a lot of confusion about this for years, because this was one of the stories that people looked at and said that this makes no sense. It doesn't match with history,
archaeological records.
And then we found it. So there was, and I'm going to slaughter his name, there is a Babylonian historian, Berosus, and Josephus, who's a later historian, refers to him. He tells us that Nebuchadnezzar was actually ordered by his dad, and I'm not even going to, Nabopolassar, I think is his name, to put down this rebellion of the Judah area, the country of Judah, in about 605. So Nebuchadnezzar went there with his armies, didn't completely put down the rebellion because his dad died while he was there. And so he had to rush back about 750 miles. How do you rush back on the back of a camel? But it was, kind of during or shortly after that then he came back after he established this. The Battle of Carchemish happened, somewhere around there. And so there's this kind of period where Judah was subservient to Babylon and yet would rebel against it. And finally, Nebuchadnezzar had enough, so he comes in, he wipes them out. But it was during that 19 years prior that he took some of the kids of some of the elite and wealthy and took them captive. And somewhere in there, we don't know exactly when, they were transported They were some of the first group transported to Babylon. Then there was others that were transported. And of course, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were part of that first group. So this connects right in with that. Right in the middle of this, you've got Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And then if we kind of fast forward, so I'm setting us up, I'm getting us towards Esther here. Babylon's power as a world empire began to wane. And about 539 BC, Cyrus the second conquers it. And then shortly thereafter, he allows the first group to return. So, and eventually became about 50,000 people were allowed to return, and they began to rebuild the temple. We talked about Ezra last week and some of the rebuilding of the temple. And somewhere in here, we have like the story of Daniel and the lion's den, somewhere in this story. So all these things kind of overlap. Well, when Cyrus, this is the kingdom of Persia, the Medes and the Persians overtook, eventually one of their capitals was Susa. So they moved from Babylon another 200 miles further east, and Daniel moved with them. And it was after that, about 530 BC, somewhere around there, Daniel passed away. But we see in the history of Persia and Babylon, his fingerprints all over. And there's still a school that existed for centuries, probably the same school that the astronomers, the wise men who made the journey to the birth of Christ were from. We've talked about that before. So this kingdom of Persia was in charge, and a king comes along. His name's Artaxerxes. And it's during this that we find the events of Esther. So we've gone from 586 to about 483, so about 100 years.
Can I stop you real quick? You're listing a whole lot of dates.
Yes.
And as I read through the Bible, I don't see 570 BC or 438 or 483 BC anywhere. Where are we getting those dates from? Just for
most of the time, most time we get those like in Isaiah, he talks about in the year King Uzziah died. So we'll date those based on what we know of who was king, who was emperor of Babylon, those kinds of things. So that's how we're dating those. And then from archaeological evidence that we've had. The fall of Jerusalem is no scholar controverts that. It's a hard date. We know that. And the fall of Babylon is a hard date. And then we have historical evidence of Artaxerxes. So we know when he was king, his first queen, Vashti, who didn't do what he wanted and come in and do the seductive dance for all of his friends, and so he deposes her. And that's when Esther becomes queen, somewhere around 484 BC. So this is where we're at. 100 years after the fall of Jerusalem. The exile, about 50,000 people at least had returned. Jerusalem was beginning to be rebuilt, but not completely rebuilt yet. It wasn't completely rebuilt until Nehemiah goes back, which is in the future. But here's the thing. After Esther becomes queen, somewhere in here, Nehemiah becomes cupbearer to the king. And so as you look at the time period, we go, oh, Nehemiah and Esther, they probably knew each other.
Which is crazy.
But we don't necessarily know that as we go into it. Ezra was in Israel.
One of the things I just want to point out quick as you're talking about archaeological records and things, one of the interesting things that you'll find as you study like archaeological records and compare them to the biblical accounts is you will not find clear archaeological evidence that disproves things that the Bible say. What happens is, well, we don't have archaeological evidence of this, therefore we don't. And then especially if you just go back and study, look at the last 50 years of archaeology, the number of things that have been discovered that continue to prove the biblical accounts as accurate is mind-blowing. And, like for instance, David isn't mentioned. We don't have any yet archaeological evidence of David being mentioned as a contemporary.
Right.
It's not until later on. So, even though all of these other David and Solomon are not real, but everybody, all the rest of them are, because we can. Well, maybe you just haven't found one yet of those two, because 50 years ago, you hadn't found them talking about this king and this king and this king, but now we found them. So anyway, I get a little sassy about it.
Yeah, well, I do too. Just three quick examples of that. So,
the Philistines is my favorite one.
Yeah.
For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, people just assumed that they were made up. The Bible made them up, and now they're not only like
archaeologically
proven archaeologically, but their importance in the region is massive. And for the longest time, the biblical account was the only account
so
we had of
people
them.
doubted it. So, and same was true like in New Testament times, a community called Magdala. Ever heard of Mary of Magdalene?
Yeah.
Just a couple of years before the last time I was in Israel, they discovered it.
Yeah.
Pilate was another one. For years, people went, no, Pilate, no, we can't trust it because we have no evidence that Pilate was around. That's the last time I was in Israel. There's a stone that was discovered actually right by the Mediterranean that specifically references Pilate. Mm-hmm. So it's not just legend and that. One of my favorites, though, is, and this was where I'll get a little sassy. So historians will look at an historical event like Hannibal crossing the Alps. We have like less than 5 historical manuscripts documenting that. We have hundreds and hundreds of documents documenting the events of Scripture, but somehow it's not enough when it comes to Scripture. Yeah. But Hannibal crossing the Alps is not questioned.
That's the same thing with like most of Caesar's accounts, especially from his wars before he took sole power of Rome. Those are considered some of the most historically accurate ancient manuscripts because of the number that they have and the recency to when they were written of the copies we found. And the biblical records knock it out of the park. I don't have the specifics in front of me right now. My dad could probably rattle them off, but it's not even close to comparable. No. And yet, well, we don't question that, but the fact that Solomon existed is crazy. Oh. But anyway,
isn't that crazy?
But that's why archaeology is important, though, because as they continue to do these things, we continue to find the accuracy of what was written, and it's amazing. I love it. So anyway, we're at Esther has become queen because of Vashti.
So now we're kind of in what's called the post-exilic period, post-exile. So people have come back from exile, but there's still a lot of Jewish people. And again, the reason they're called Jewish people is because the only ones who are left are primarily of the tribe of Judah, Judah and Benjamin, but mostly Judah. So that's why they're called that. They're spread throughout the Persian Empire. And so it's during this time, just to give you understanding of your Bible, because remember, it's sometimes in different spots. We have some key prophets that are during this time. We talked about the prophet Haggai when we looked at Ezra. He talks about the principle of priority. There's Zechariah, he gives these 8 visions of hope. There's Obadiah, the shortest, smallest book of prophecy in the Old Testament. Is Obadiah. It's like one chapter. It's very nationalistic, which is interesting. But it promises God is still involved in protecting and planning for redemption. And then Joel, what's interesting with Joel is we know nothing about Joel's life other than what he writes. But it's an amazing book about putting God first. And if you want to know how to turn your heart back to God, read Joel. He talks about how to turn back. Then, and I won't make my Italian prophet joke, but I just referred to it.
Bless you.
Malachi. And here's what's interesting. Is we aren't even sure that was his name. That's just the title given to this. It means one who is a messenger. But it's a prophet. These are the last...
I don't know if I knew that.
Yeah, these are the last recorded words before the several hundred years. And then Jesus comes. And it's filled with promise and with warning. As you go there. So these little books are so important.
Why, to move us along and then sneak in the question that I wanted to add.
Yeah.
Why is this in the Bible? Why is Esther in there? Why, because of where it's located? It just feels like it's not for, I don't know, why is it in there? And Esther in particular does not mention God once in the entire book.
It's one of 2. Ruth doesn't either.
And so, why is this an important part? So much so because there's plenty of books. 31 weeks through the Old Testament. There's more than 31 books, so it's not like every single book we're spending an entire weekend. But this is one of the ones we're spending a weekend. Why is this one important enough for us to not skip over?
One of the things is this particular book, one of the reasons it was included in the Old Testament is it explains the origin of one of the most important festivals and celebration of God's involvement in his people, in the history of the people of Abraham, in the history of the Old Testament, and that's the Festival of Purim, which, and we talked about the dice, and it just, as you read through Esther, everything revolves around the roll of the dice. It's this repeating kind of phrase that the author used, and it feels like life feels sometimes, right? It feels like, okay, the dice just rolled. I got snake eyes. Here we go again. And it just feels like everything's going by chance. And yet, and this is a worldview shift. This is part of what we talked about, particularly online this last weekend, is we can have one of two worldviews with this. Is we can have the worldview of, man, everything is against me. I just need to fight. Or we can have the worldview, even when it feels like everything is against me, God hasn't given up the authorship of my story. He's still got this. And even though we keep messing with things and throwing in subplots, he just takes them and weaves them into his plot. So Haman thought that this would be the end of the Jewish people finally, and he would get all of his generations of revenge, all the way back. And God just goes, yeah, whatever. I've got this, and this is going to become one of the greatest celebration moments of, you need to trust, I will always put the right person at the right time for such a time as this. And if it's true then, here's why it's in the Bible, if it's true then, it's still true for you and for me. So I think that answers it in a huge way.
I wanted to ask, this is not in your notes, and it's just random. Why would so many of the Jewish people have stayed when they were allowed to go back? But clearly there's enough of them to have a big enough impact where Haman, wants to purge them from his, from his society, and a big enough where it's an impact of like, this is going to be a huge thing. Like this isn't, it's not like 5 families stayed and, because, a person that high up in the government there could have dealt with, a small number of people without all of the pomp and circumstance he was going for. But why do you think, why were there still so many Jewish people there?
All we have is opinion and speculation there, right? But I think of it in terms of how we live. So someone moves, we'll put it in the Williston context. Not that everybody listens to this from Williston, but how many people do we know in Williston who moved here temporarily because of an oil field job? I'm going to move here, and I'm going to move here for a while.
Sure.
And then I'm going to move back, And sometimes that's true. But there are a lot of people that move here and gone, oh, this is a great place to be. I'm raising my kids here. I've got a job here. There's no reason for me to travel, especially if they've migrated with the empire now to Susa, almost 900 miles away. Why would I put my family through 900 miles of danger and whatever to go back? This is good, and this is okay. So I think it's just, for a lot of people, it was just probably convenience. For someone like a Daniel, when we read, he wanted to go back. And God said no. And sometimes that's true for us. We don't, Esther, she didn't want to be, let's just call it what it is, the king's bedroom plaything. I mean, that's really what she was. And was that God's plan that's what she would be? No, but God certainly redeemed that moment for the sake of his people. And I think for us, God gives us the choice. Will you trust me in this, and I'll even redeem dislocation and where you are. So there's some of that.
To close us out, just talk a little, if anything else you want to say about, especially the exile period. You mentioned all those prophets from this period. One of which was it Obadiah was it's so short, nationalistic,
very nationalistic.
They just it doesn't seem like I need to read this tiny little book about a nationalistic revival of the nation of Israel from 400 whatever BC. But why? So why is there so much from this time of exile in there?
I think. Here's what I think. I believe that the writings from the exile and the return are maybe some of the most important parts of the Bible for us today, other than the Gospels. Some people I know they say, well, maybe it's the book of Revelation because we're close to the end. We've talked about that before. I won't get into that. But because especially now, like in North America, we are living in a post-Christian culture. We may not like that, but we are. We're living in a post-Christian culture, and there's tremendous pressure for us to conform to the culture. Same kind of pressure Daniel faced and the Jewish people faced. And so these books of prophecy and stories of Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel, I think are very timely for us. Like we talked about with Daniel, how to deal with pressure. Ezra and Haggai, the priority of putting God first when the world says it's normal not to, and it's okay. Someone kind of coined a phrase. It's not that, especially American people, aren't spiritual nowadays. But we've invented our own religion. We call it Christianity, but really it's moralistic therapeutic deism. Basically, we believe in morals. Morals will shift, is what we say. It's therapeutic. I need it to make me feel better. And it's deism. I believe in a God, but not in a God who's deeply, deeply involved unless I want him to be. And we may not call it that, but that's the way so many of us live, even inside the church. And so there's this priority, like we talked about with Esther, the importance of having a hope-filled worldview rather than the world is going to hell in a handbasket and I just need to fight my way out. I don't find any person who has a genuine, deep relationship with God and understanding who he is who says that should be your worldview. We have a hope-filled worldview. And we'll talk about with Nehemiah. It talks about how to rebuild broken things. And we live in a world where there's a lot of stuff that's broken, including us, right? And God invites us to be part of this. So these are things that we learn from these prophets and these stories right now. And God is God. We don't define him. He defines him. We need him. And our idea for life seems to make sense, but it really doesn't. And that's what got God's people into exile in the first place. We have an idea for God. We have an idea for how life should work. It got them in trouble in the first place. The book of Proverbs, written just shortly before the exile, or the divided kingdom, Proverbs 14, one of my favorite verses in all of Proverbs says, there's a way that seems right to a person, but in the end it leads to death. And if there is any verse that describes how sometimes we approach, even those of us who call ourselves Christian, it's that there's a way that seems right to us. Because why? Because we kind of have put God into a God of our making when realizing he is a holy God, a loving God, but also a God, like we talked about a few weeks ago, of judgment and discipline. And we've got to wrap our way around that. If we believe the God of the Bible is the God of the Bible, we don't get to choose who he is. And we don't get to choose how we live. I mean, we can, but it's not in a punitive way. God said, I designed life to work best a certain way. And if you want to go any other way, go for it. But it's always going to end up in exile.
Well, thank you, Pastor Mike, as always. Enjoyed sitting here and chatting with you. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed it as well. Hopefully you learned something. Again, as our homework or next step or whatever we're calling it these days on the Grow Podcast has been and will continue to be while we're in Greatest Story Ever Told major overarching series, it's to keep reading. So make sure that you're reading along, whether you got the book, The Story, which again is just the Bible put chronologically, or if you're just reading along in the Bible. We have that reading plan on our website, correct? Do you remember the link? Do you remember the link for it?
I don't.
It's on our website, I promise. And so you can go find that if you're just reading along in the Bible.
If you're in a small group, I know all of our small group leaders have access to it.
Our small groups all have it. So make sure that you're reading along with us. Growth always starts with the next step. So it was a great next step to be here this week, but let's make sure here listening to the podcast this week, make sure we continue to take next steps this week. Not just come and listen because Pastor Mike's super fun to listen to talk about. You just wanted to hear him say a bunch of dates today. I think that's why everybody came. That's my favorite thing about people that didn't like history growing up is because when you ask them why, they're like, it's just a bunch of names and dates and things. And it's because they didn't have a teacher who helped them understand history is a story. And yes, there are names and dates tied to those, but way more important is the story of why we have those names.
The names and dates are just the chapter titles, the chapter numbers.
And it's the same thing as, as we're going through the historical context of this and, you're I'm just looking at some of your notes, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel were prophets until about 570 BC. Well, a bad history teacher would have just said Jeremiah and Ezekiel were prophets until 570 BC. Make sure you remember that for the test. Yeah. But that's why I love this podcast and how you've been teaching too. Is we're not just learning the names and dates. We're learning why it's important that Jeremiah and Ezekiel were prophets until 570 BC, because it's important to know who they were talking to. And yeah, anyway, I love it. Let's keep talking history, Pastor Mike.
Yep.
We love you. Make sure that you subscribe if you haven't yet, so you get notified when the new episodes go out every Monday at 6 a.m. We hope that we will see you next time.